But since you left office, people are so much more scattered. Not only what issues are number one, but also, you know, we're at war in more places. We are intervening in places where it's not exactly war, and it's not. The headlines that are on people's cell phones that drive the day are not just about this issue, no matter how compelling it may be. And it seems that it would make it more difficult to come up with a consistent, cohesive message for Democrats or Republicans in an election year like this.
Well, I agree with that to a point. That is, there are more sources of information, and there are more things being done that are hard to put into a clear pattern. It's what happens if you live in an interdependent world with instantaneous transmission of information where borders look more like nets than walls. When you get right down to it, that's at the heart of this little spat we've seen unfolding in America about what should be the final steps between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, they're sort of a microcosm of the larger global interdependence that you can actually see there. Okay, I agree with all that. But the fundamental problem that I think we have in America, let me just contrast America with Brazil just for a minute. A guy named Bill Bishop, who happened to be a liberal Democrat, wrote a book 2 years ago called The Big Sort. He's from Austin, Texas, S-O-R-T. And he started off with the story of the one Republican family that lived in his very Democratic voting precinct in Austin, Texas, where John Kerry beat President Bush 3-1. And this guy loved his Republican neighbor, and their kids played together, and they talked, and they disagreed, and they learned together. But everybody else was mean to him, so he moved to another neighborhood in Austin where President Bush beat John Kerry 4-1. And the argument that Bishop makes in the book is that both neighborhoods were worse off. And he said, America's overcome, we're not as racist or as sexist or as homophobic as we used to be, don't have much religious prejudice at all anymore. We just don't want to be around anybody that disagrees with us. And I think you're all laughing because you know there's something to it, right? So, and he actually described a development and how a developer made a fortune in the Inland Empire outside of LA or near there by doing a profile and finding out the people who were upper income people he wanted in his development were almost evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. So he divides one side of, it was a one street long development, one side for the Republicans and another side for the Democrats. I couldn't make this up. The Republican developments had sidewalks and basketball courts in the back. The Democratic developments had rooms for yoga mats and other things. I swear to God, he sold all the houses in a nanosecond. So, by contrast, I was in Brazil, in Manaus, on the edge of the rainforest, the other day for a sustainability conference, and they got serious problems in Brazil. 95% of their electricity is from renewable sources. They want it to be more even as they grow, so they want to build 3 hydro plants. The problem is that the dams have to be on rivers that flow fast, and all the ones that are left are in the rainforest. So they've got competing sustainability arguments. Serious problem. But what was the difference? Here I was at this conference in this nice little conference center. You had every oil company, every utility company, the head of the Green Party, the head of the people representing the indigenous tribes, one of which will be totally destroyed if one of these big dams is built, and all these people whose interests are affected, and they're actually sitting down having an honest, civil conversation and a 2-day seminar where they all listen to each other and try to work through this. Now, I don't want to be Pollyanna here, but this is a hell of a deal. Until this last year when Brazil had slippage, they reduced under Lula rainforest annual destruction by 75%. Little known fact. They got all the loggers out, but they're still pushing the cattle farmers and soybean people in.
Did you sit there fantasizing about having that kind of conversation here?
Well, I think we should. We should try. And maybe we'll have to go through another election. But in the end, we have to listen to people who disagree with us. It cannot be possible that either the Democrats or the Republicans are always wrong. It cannot be possible that 100% of us are proceeding in bad faith. You know, I basically think that the country's been badly hurt in the last 30 years by the adoption of 2 ideas, one predominantly in business, one in government. The business idea was that corporations are not really creatures of the state. They're independent entities just like citizens. They ought to be able to do whatever they want in elections, and their only responsibility is to their shareholders. Since people hold shares for 15 seconds now before they sell them, what it means is that corporations have become uprooted. My generation was taught, those who went to business school and studied economics, corporations were creatures of the society, and they had responsibilities to all their stakeholders. Yes, they're shareholders, but they're employees and their customers and the communities of which they were a part. We're going to have to go back toward that. The primary government idea we had was the one that triumphed in the 1980 election. The government will screw up a two-part parade. The secular saints of America are the founding fathers. They were all perfect. Just about everything that's happened in the last 80 years is horrible. Government always screws up. There is no such thing as a bad tax cut or a bad regulation or a bad this or a bad that as opposed to government. It hasn't worked. Look at the job numbers, look at the deficit numbers, look at the growth numbers, look at the productivity numbers, look at the numbers. So we have to, if we can break out of theology and get back to evidence and experience and the aspirations of ordinary people, I think we can have bipartisan cooperation. And I think the Democrats are going to have to be willing to give up maybe some short-term political gains by whipping up fears on some of these things if it's a reasonable Social Security proposal, a reasonable Medicare proposal. We've got to deal with these things. You cannot have health care devour the economy.
I have one more question for you, but before that, I wouldn't be a reporter if I didn't follow up on an allusion you made to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Did all of this sound terribly familiar to you, this debate in the last 4 or 5 days about this 1967 borders, and do you feel like it's moved anywhere, or is this
Yeah, I think, for one thing, I think to some extent it's a tempest in a teapot. And I think, first, what the president said was maybe too much shorthand and raised a lot of questions, but also but remember what Prime Minister Netanyahu said yesterday, amidst all the things that are in the headlines. He also said that if he made a peace agreement with the Palestinians, he was well aware that he would have to give up so much of the West Bank that not all the settlements would be included and he would have to close some.
And he'd never said that out loud before.
No. And I think, that has been totally overlooked, and he deserves credit for saying that, especially when you look at how hard it was on Sharon to get out of Gaza, which nearly everybody wanted to do except the settlers that were living there. So when Mr. Netanyahu was prime minister before and I was president, when all the people I worked with for 8 years, saying the 67 borders were a reference point was nothing more than saying that's what we looked at the map on. When Prime Minister Barak said that he was prepared to give up 94 to 96% of the West Bank with land swaps in return for certain strict requirements on the Palestinians, including waiving the right of return. It's 94 to 96% of what? In other words, the 67 borders were the reference point. I think that's what the president meant. He wanted to, but I also believe that before they get back to the table, Israel's entitled to know that at the end there will be recognition of the state of Israel. And my recollection is that President Abbas has already said publicly at some point in the Bush years that A, he would accept the deal that Arafat didn't, that I offered, B, that he would give up a universal right of return. They gave that up when they signed the agreement on the White House lawn in 1993, whether they acknowledge it or not. The Israelis always said there are some families that have been in northwestern Israel forever who are, their descendants are now in those Lebanese camps. We'll let some of them back in. But if there's going to be a peace deal, it's got to be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, heavy majority. Everybody knows that. I even offered as a part of this deal when I was working to raise $10 billion, which was real money back then, to resettle the Palestinians out of the refugee camps, either in the new state of Palestine or in the U.S., Canada, or wherever the heck else they wanted to go that people would take them. So I think that, I don't think we should get too carried away here. That if you look at the map, any operating map that any of these negotiators have used, it's clear what the boundaries were before and after 67. And it's also clear that because the peace was not made in 2000 or in the intervening years, that the land differences will be great now. Like when I was president, you could get 97% of the Israeli settlers in the West Bank on 3% of the land. Now you have to take 6% of the land just to get 80% of the settlers. So that is a very, I don't want to minimize the difficulty, but I wouldn't just, don't let this thing get off the tracks here because of the way what the president said and what Prime Minister Netanyahu said have been juxtaposed. You can overstate the divide here. As long as they're both willing to keep talking about this, I think they should. There's just two other things that I think were not mentioned by either that I think it's a mistake to forget. One of Israel's legitimate complaints with Arafat was always they could never be sure they had a partner for peace. Although in '98, when we had lots of things going, was the only year in the history of Israel when no one was killed by a terrorist attack because of the security cooperation. The second argument was, even if we make this peace, our neighbors will never accept us. There's no question that the King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia's peace initiative includes all the Arab countries but Syria and other Muslim countries around the world, promising political, economic, security normalization. If I were the Prime Minister, I know he feels this way, I'd want to get it at the same time. But, you know, but if he got a simultaneous peace signing with all these countries that normalize relations, that'd be worth something. Neither side, neither the President nor the Prime Minister, I don't think, talked about that. But those two things should not be ignored given the recent developments in the Arab world.
Mr. President, George Mitchell stepped down, so there's an opening for an envoy, if you're interested.
I have great confidence in the Secretary of State. They don't need me.